Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for What About the Kids? If any of you were at the New York State Funeral Directors Association convention, this program was also offered there. Unfortunately, it was offered with other programs, and we didn't have too many people who were able to take advantage. And this program was it was highly, highly rated with some excellent information. So we wanted to give everyone the opportunity to hear this. Just a couple housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them in the question box, and Adam will gladly answer them as we go along. Upon completion of this webinar, it will take about 5 to 7 business days to get the portal updated with your CEU, and you will receive a certificate in the mail. At this time, I'd like to welcome Adam Carter. Adam is the National Clinical Director for the National Alliance for Children's Grief. He is a professional counselor and counselor educator who received his doctoral degree in counseling education and supervision with an emphasis in multicultural counseling from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Adam has taught courses in CACREP, accredited master's level clinical mental health programs, and doctoral level courses in counselor education and supervision, and served as the coordinator of the Trauma-Informed Counseling Graduate Certificate at Northern Illinois University. Welcome, Adam.
Oh, thank you, Kelly. Welcome. Thank you for having me to this. Well, for me, it's still morning. I'm here in Illinois. I guess it just turned noon. But thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I want to welcome everyone today and thank you for taking some time to talk about some of our smaller friends who are involved in the process of grief, and more specifically, what happens during this process almost immediately after a death. What do we as adults need to take into consideration, and how can we help create some spaces within our businesses and our funeral homes that allow children to be present, to participate, but also to feel safe and seen during those processes. I like to start this conversation by sharing one of my earliest memories of a funeral. And in my grandfather passed away when I was in the 7th grade, died of cancer, and it was my first significant loss. I remember that being the first funeral that I remember ever going to. And for me, it was kind of formative in my experience, because it was a very small funeral home in rural West Virginia. The gentleman who ran the funeral home attended my graduation party. So very small community. Everyone knew each other. He was on my Christmas card list until he passed. But so we knew each other. The families were aware of each other, and we knew each other. And when it came time for the day of the service, the way that he lined up my family to go in to sit down before the service started is he had my dad and his brothers and sisters at the front of the line, and then my grandfather's brothers and sisters, and then his grandchildren. And keeping in mind, I was the oldest grandchild at the time, and I was in the 7th grade, and I thought that's the way it was supposed to work. So we went into the service, and I was extremely overwhelmed at what was happening. I was extremely overwhelmed of seeing my grandfather in a casket, and my mom and dad were about 3 or 4 rows ahead of me. So I didn't have an adult who I could check in with to make sure that this was normal. Am I okay? What's going to happen next? And it was me and my cousins in the back, just kind of sitting there, trying to make sense of what was occurring. This was in the 90s, and I know that this is not practice that we do anymore. Hopefully it wasn't practice that a lot of folks were doing in the 90s, but the way that the service was being ran was very commonplace in where we were from at the time. And so I think about that a lot when I think about the work that I do and that we do with children. So my background is in working with children, especially younger children. My area of kind of, if you call it expertise, is with smaller children, 3 to 5 year olds, and their grief responses. But I've worked with children and their families for 20 years, and the past 10 focusing on grief and how families can support children who are grieving, and how children can kind of experience that grief in a way that is that is healthy, if you will, because I don't think there's any right or wrong way to grieve, but there are healthier ways to grieve, and sometimes we need to be supported with that. So when I talk about children, I want to let you know I'm not going to talk specifically about numbers and age ranges. I think that's important, and we have a lot of really good resources for free available at nacg.org that talks about how children at certain ages and around those ages developmental levels grieve, and how we can talk about that. It's a lot of information, and that could be our entire conversation today. But for this conversation, I wanted to bring in something that may actually help ground us a little more, as opposed to the age, but really a child's understanding, and any person's understanding, but a child's understanding and thinking about death. And we have it divided into these 4 main concepts, right? So the first being the inevitability or universality of death, meaning that all things that are alive must die. When I ran a preschool grief group, we did this game where we would put pictures, it was clip art on the floor that was laminated, and it was of things that were alive, that could die, and inanimate objects. We did not even think about it at the time, but we had a picture of a cell phone on the floor. So we would play the music, and children, this was anyone between 3 and not yet in kindergarten, they were to jump on something that they knew was alive and that could die. Well, the first time that a child jumped onto the cell phone, and we were like, well, is a cell phone alive? And they say, well, my mom says that her cell phone dies all the time. It was the first real time that I came face to face with the concept that we use that word die quite often in our conversations with children, but not really discussing death of human or things that were alive. So we talk about dying when it comes to electronics a lot. So that's important to know, because especially young children's understanding of the word die means that if something dies, all you really got to do is plug it back in and wait for a little while, and it comes back to life. So, you know, that factors in a little bit later about the second piece, which is this irreversibility and finality, that once the physical body dies, it cannot become alive again. And that's a little confusing if only thing that they've heard is this word die, and that things die, and that cell phones die, and my computer dies, or my car died. A lot of these uses of the word died, those things can be fixed. Not only can they be fixed, that children can watch them be fixed. And children as young as 3 know how to plug in an iPad, right? So children as young as 3 know how to fix things that have died. Now, once that becomes physical, and we're talking about bodies, and we're talking about things that exist in the world, that becomes confusing. Because if an iPad or a cell phone dies, and we can bring it back to life, why does, when our grandparent dies, we're using that same word, why do they not come back to life? And why aren't they not coming back to life? Why is their body not coming back to life? So those first 2, it's the first concept, all things that are alive must die. And the second is, once the physical body dies, it cannot become alive again. The third is cessation of body function, which life functions that keep the body alive stop at death. I've supported a lot of children and families during funeral processes where, and I'm sure if we were in a group together and I would see some head nods, where individuals say, well, one, they look like they're sleeping. And oftentimes that's what we will tell children, is it will look like they're sleeping, or they're sleeping. And we're not saying that as professionals, but sometimes folks are saying that because they're in the middle of their own turmoil. They're in the middle of trying to make sense of this loss, of this death. They themselves are just hanging on by a thread every day, and you have a child who you're trying to help support through very similar experiences. So sometimes it just needs to be said because you need to move on. You need a moment of respite, of care. You can't think about a child at this moment because I myself am so overwhelmed. Now, the downside of that is that when we're looking at children early, again, really early right now, because we're gonna age them up. When we're looking at younger children take naps, and naps involve sleep. So it is not uncommon at all for a child to have, one, either been told that someone is asleep when they're in a casket or they're viewing a body, or that they say that someone went to sleep, and even not seeing the body, the child then starts to have some sleep disruptions, because sleep only really impacts a body that's alive. That bodies that are not alive or dead bodies do not sleep, because that is a life function. Sleeping is a function of life. The same thing about when you're viewing a body and the body looks like the chest is rising or not. It looks like they may be breathing, right? Because we are conditioned. We know that chest should rise. We see that. We know that when people are asleep, their chest rise. So our minds start to fill in some blanks, especially when we're younger, that says, okay, yes, that I do see the chest rising. They are alive. And so at that age, not understanding, or early ages, not understanding that all functions of the body stop at death. And then the last is this causation. Understanding that different things can lead to death. And this comes into play whenever you're thinking about a child's experience with death for the first time, especially a younger child. And let's say again, it is a cancer death. That's that their grandparent died of cancer. I'm using that over and over because that's my experience, and I feel comfortable using that one. But I was old enough to understand that other things, people die for other reasons as well. I was in the 7th grade. I understand that people die from accidents. I understand that people die from other illnesses. I understand that sometimes people die by suicide. I understood that. But if I go younger, I may think that the only thing that causes death is the thing that was my experience. So that everyone dies of cancer, right? We think about it sometimes in that our desire to move children through that process. We sometimes even say, grandpa was really old. Well, we don't die of old age, right? That's just, we know that. We don't die because of our age. We die because our body has stopped working, or there's parts of our bodies that stop working, and that results in the body dying. So when we talk about, well, grandpa was really old and he died, well, okay, so the only thing is that old people die. That's what I may be thinking early on that causation piece, right? So that middle column talks about what the child may be thinking prior to that, acquiring that concept. And this is important before we move into specifically talking about how to create these spaces inside of our facilities, because it's important to realize that there's some things that we can do that can either contribute to maybe some of this confusion in thinking, or there's things that we can do to anticipate it and help with those pieces. So those first pieces is children's thinking prior to the inevitability and universality, is that some people may not die. And again, I've worked with families who want to tell their children, no, mommy's not going to die right now. And sometimes the muscles in my neck get tense because we don't have a lot of control over that sometimes, right? We don't know when we're going to die. So when we tell a young child that mom or dad is not going to die right now, or that, grandma's not going to die, or, your dog's not going to die, we're contributing to this, well, some things do live, and some things do live forever. And so what we can do instead is we can point out to a child, instead of saying, you know, your dad's not going to die, what we can say is, you know, you, you are taken care of. Let's talk about the people who take care of you and how they take care of you, because young children, especially young children, they're not necessarily going to get into this really deep reasoning conversation with you. Sometimes they may say, "Is that what I ask?" But really what they want is they're checking to see, am I going to be cared for? Am I going to be okay? When people around me die, am I going to be okay? And children at this age, early ages too, understand that they themselves are going to die. And that can be concerning. That's overwhelming, especially we as adults probably don't remember the first time that we realized that we were going to die. You may, but that thought process, the instant, the moment that you had the mental capacity to understand that at some point in time you are going to cease to exist, and how overwhelming that is, right? Especially when we're young. So that once a child understands and has mastery of the concept of inevitability, they understand that all people die, right? And so what we can do between those periods of time is talk about how a child is kept safe, who loves the child, how are things being taken care of, and really not pulling a child from the process to keep them safe, but including them in the process in places that are developmentally appropriate. Because if we pull them too soon and we say, well, we're not going to do this part, we're not going to do this part, we potentially can contribute to keeping a child into that position of some things may not die. Irreversibility starts with that death is reversible, like we talked about plugging in a cell phone or getting a new battery for your car. There's faith-based systems that have stories of individuals who were dead who come back alive, and hearing those stories as early as 3, 4, and 5 in religious teachings and Sunday school, in mosque, and places along those lines, in temple, there's potentially some confusion with that. So I am not saying do not tell those stories. Rather, what I'm saying is when those stories are told, making sure that the adults or the caregivers around that child are prepared to have those conversations about what was specific about this event that made death reversible. That's a key part of the spirituality aspect of things. But understanding that death is forever and cannot be reversed is important. And the way that we can contribute to that, or the way we can help adults who care for children and love children, is we talk about death as early as possible. And adults do not tend to like to talk about death and grief with children. It's something that's actually actively avoided. I've watched my entire professional career well-meaning adults change the subject when a child asks a question about death or grief. And what I encourage is the conversations around things like, when we talk about all things that are alive die, and understanding that death cannot be reversed, there are probably things that are dead in every one of our house right now. This isn't a comment on cleanliness, but if I go to my windowsill right now, I know that there's a dead fly or two. Here in Illinois, we have little things that look like ladybugs, but they're not. They love to eat our corn. And this time of the year, sometimes they're covering the outside of our windows, and they'll get into the screen and then they'll die. And so we have things that were alive that are now dead. And as early as 2 or 3 years old, we can talk about that bug is dead, right? We start smaller. We start in something that a child may not have an emotional connection to. They may. I've met a lot of very soft-hearted children that grow attached to things like bugs and worms and squirrels. But when they don't have that connection to it, or have that personal kind of investment, that's a time we can have those conversations to say that death is forever and cannot be reversed. And so encouraging caregivers to have those conversations early on at age appropriate and smaller levels, so that when we need to have conversations about people dying or pets dying, things that a child may have a strong emotional connection to, we've already started laying that groundwork, right? the next about the cessation of body functionings, believe those who are dead can still do those that are alive, like sleep, for example. As children get older and master this concept under the thinking of death, they understand that people who are dead do not function internally or externally, meaning the body is no longer thinking, the body is no longer moving, the body is no longer functioning the way that it did prior to death, right? And we can have some conversations around that, and we can support caregivers in saying, I think I saw him breathe. It may look like he was breathing because we think about him breathing, but his body doesn't breathe anymore. His lungs don't take in air. And just being very specific and talking about very specifically what is going on, as opposed to getting really concerned that the child wants to know the ins and outs of it, when all honesty, they just want to check in. They're really usually just wanting to check in to say, did I just see that? No, it may have looked like that, but his body doesn't breathe anymore. Because if a child then watches a body be lowered into a grave, and if there's things put on top of the casket, then the child may be thinking, wait a minute, Grandpa, I saw him breathing, and no one told me he wasn't. So is he safe in there? And so having these conversations to let children know that the body is no longer working, the body's not working like our body is working, is important. And then the last with causation is again supporting and talking about, again, you don't have to list ways that people die, but you go back to the conversation that's saying death is when our body no longer works. Our body is no longer working, and that's the best way I have found. And we start there, and then I let the child kind of lead in terms of any questions they may have. Because again, a lot of well-meaning adults may start to put a lot of words in between them and the child, because it's not a conversation we want to have. And so we'll put a lot of things in between us and the child, when really what we can do is have that sentence that their body is no longer working, and see if the child has any questions after that. I've worked with families where it has been one or two sentences and the child's like, all right, thank you, and they go about playing. And that's completely normal, right? Play is a child's form of communication. So the child may be playing to try to make sense of things in their own mind, but then come back and revisit that with the caregiver over and over again. So these four things, these four periods of understanding, those are the things that I would encourage us to look at and lay that on top of kind of age as we move forward, because just because a child is of a certain age doesn't mean that they have acquired that concept yet. For example, my children, I have one is in their first year of college, and the youngest is a freshman. We have been talking about death and things dying since they have been born, because that is my understanding of the world, and that's the way I make sense of things. And so my children understand that things die, and probably more than they want to talk about, right? That death is a part of things and grief is a part of things, and so they may have some acquiring of these concepts earlier than, say, some children whose families choose not to have these conversations. I feel very fortunate to have grown up in a household where my mother had these conversations with me and my dad avoided them. My dad does not like to talk about death, does not like to talk about dying, but for my mom, it was a very important part of life. And so we were going to have these conversations. So age is a big part of it, but also just think about exposure to these concepts as you're thinking about child-friendly spaces inside of your facility. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is how to work with and prepare children for, let's say, a service itself. But before I do that, I just want to check in with Kelly to see if there's any questions or anything I can clarify about death understanding and children's thinking.
Not as of now. Thank you, Adam.
All right. So as we're thinking about the service or a service or what the family is choosing to do at the end of life processing, there's some things to consider, and these are some things that we may even feel comfortable talking with the caregivers or caregivers as they're coming in to do preparation or final arrangement service arrangements, excuse me. So the first is, does the child, do they, being the child, want to attend the service? So there may be children who want to attend the service, they want to be present in the service, they want to be there, they want all of those, they want to be with their family, whereas there may be some children that do not want to attend the service. And so in that moment, when we have those conversations, we can say, is there something that we can do to help prepare, or is there something that we can do where the child can participate? Because we do believe it's important that a child is part of this aspect of closure, but we're never going to force the child to be there. But if there's something that we can do, maybe being there 15 or 20 minutes early before something starts, where a child can experience something and then they themselves may leave, or that there can be some pieces where they may be present in the building but in a different space, so they can be with their caregivers as needed. That's an important question. The other part of that, the they, is the caregiver. Does the caregiver want the child present in the service? And there's some things that are very important with that. And because grief and death is so individualized, we may not know how individuals at a service may respond. And so a lot of times when caregivers are asking me this question, they're really concerned about crying. They're concerned about their children hearing crying and concerned around adults who are sad. Children tend to handle that relatively well if they understand that, one, again, that they're safe, two, that there's no adults who are mad at them. Adults are not mad at you. Adults are not sad at your behaviors, because there's a lot of egocentrism, a lot of thinking about, this is about me, right? People are thinking about me right now. Nope, adults are not thinking about you right now. They're sad that grandpa's body's no longer working. They're sad that grandpa died. And so you may hear people who are crying. You may hear people who, you may hear someone tell a story, and then you may hear people laugh, right? And preparing them for those things. But that's the first thing, is, do they want the child to attend the service? The second, is it going to be an open or closed casket or cremation? The reason being is the way that you prepare a child for those three things is going to be different, right? So what we want to do is let a child know what is coming and what to expect. If a casket is going to be open, then they're going to see a body that's no longer alive, right? And preparing them for that. And we're going to talk about what that looks like in the next section. How long will the service last? Thinking about the average attention span of a very young child, and then as a child who's elementary age and middle and high school, how long are we expecting the child to be able to have control over their body? And that's the way I like to phrase it, because it's not always a choice for a child. It's not always a choice for some adults, right? About how long do I have control over my body? So if the service is going to be relatively brief, then we can make sure the child goes to the bathroom before. We can let them know what to prepare for, and then we let them know how they know it's over. But if it's going to be a longer service, maybe there needs to be a plan in place to think about who's going to care for the needs of a child's body, so that their caregivers can remain in the service, so that there's maybe a trusted friend or family member who is going to be the child liaison to be able to escort the child to the bathroom, or take them to get something to eat, or even just step outside for a breather if it gets too overwhelming, and then be able to come back in. And then, do you anticipate grief reactions that may be confusing to a child? And again, this is something we don't always know, but there may be conversations that can be had during those processes that may help. One of the ones that comes to mind is, I was working with a family who the father had passed, the father died, and the mother had brought her children in to see us, and she was very concerned about the service because dad was actually having an affair. and the person he was having an affair with was going to be present at the funeral. They had made it known that they were coming to the funeral, that they wanted to be involved, and they wanted to say goodbye to this man as well. And so the conversation that happened with mom had to be around not only making room for her grief and her experience of being with her husband, but also the anger that she was expressing that this person was going to be there. It was really an interesting anger because she actually greenlit her to be there. They would have asked her not to be in the building if the mom would have said, nope, she can't be in the building. But mom said, yep, she could be in the building. She was understanding that she was going to be sad, but she said, I don't know how I'm going to react. So that was one of those few instances where I knew in advance that there may be a grief reaction that is confusing to a child, because it's not only the grief over his death, but also the grief and anger over finding out that this man that you loved was having an affair. But there may be some things that are confusing. So do you know of someone in the family who has very large expressions of grief during funerals that the child may need to be prepared for? That's something to think about. And when you're thinking about how to arrange the child in the space, that may be something that wants to be taken into consideration. So before the service, I have before, during, and then after. Some things for you here to consider. Before the service, one is to prepare the child by helping answer these questions. These are things that we can give to caregivers, or we can help caregivers understand as we move forward, that they can prepare the child for. So who will be at the service? When the child shows up, who's going to be there? Right? At any age, doesn't matter the age, but if you think about it, sometimes there's family members that we only see during holidays or times of celebration. And so it may be confusing to a child when they show up to a funeral service and individuals are mourning, but these are usually people who are together at the family barbecue playing volleyball, or telling stories or laughing, or these are this is the family member who always brings their guitar and they like to sing, but right now they're not very joyful, they're not singing. So who will be there, and helping prepare the child to tell the child who will be there, right? What is going to happen is extremely important. How do we know it started? What is it going to look like when it went during the process? And how do we know what is going to happen during the service, right? So what is going to happen during that time? Who is going to be talking? What will be happening? Because again, there's two things that I say are very, very scripted during a person's life. And it's usually a wedding ceremony and a funeral. Those things are relatively scripted. And the reason being is because they have to be, so everyone knows what's going on and how to move around that space in an organized manner. It's a beautiful choreography is really what it is. And so because we know that, how do we prepare a child for what they may see? If it's say a military funeral and there's going to be a 21 gun salute, preparing them for the fact that there is going to be gunfire, and what is that gunfire for? What does that mean? When will the service happen? Is it going to happen in the morning? Is it going to happen in the afternoon? And then orienting, especially for younger children, in time of when they do things. So for example, we can, instead of saying it's going to happen at 9 a.m., when a child has no concept of time, we can say it's going to happen right after we eat breakfast. We're then going to put on these clothes and we're going to go back to this place, or we're going to go to this place, or it's going to be right after we have lunch. But when is it going to happen in my day, and how do I prepare for it? Because depending on the loss and the child, they may be missing something that they would rather be doing. So preparing them for that may help with that process. Where will the service take place? And preferably, if it's a concern, that this is not the first time the child's been there. So offering opportunities for a family to make arrangements, but also to bring the child back prior to any service that may take place, a viewing or the service itself. to be able to see where it's going to be? Or is it going to happen at the cemetery or graveyard? Or is it going to happen because grandpa's body was cremated, we're going to have a service next to the fishing pond where he loved to fish, and that's where we're going to be. And that's important. And the last is, why are we doing this? And it's incredibly important to be able to share, why are we doing this, so a child understands that they themselves get to contribute in some way, shape, or form. And so whatever the family's understanding of why they have this end of life service, right? Some families use the word closure, some families use the words an opportunity to say goodbye. Whatever the family's words, however they're describing why they're there with you, is what we follow. I don't have a script I use on any of these questions, because it's so rooted in the family. So we listen to the family, we hear what they have to say. We can always provide suggestions if asked for, but that if asked for being that key piece. Otherwise, we're going to help them through their process as they understand it. Now, as we're talking about before service and we're preparing the child, there's some things to think about, and use those 5 senses. And this is with any child, not just young children, but what are they going to hear? What music is going to be playing? What does it sound like? Think about that. Is it going to be a CD of your grandfather's favorite songs, or is it going to be more somber music that fills in the space in the background, but isn't overwhelming and doesn't necessarily have a lot of emotional attachment, but it's something that keeps the space kind of filled and warm. Also prepare them for silence. Children themselves, regardless of age, sometimes are not used to that silence, and that silence is almost punitive. It's a punishment. And so we walk in somewhere, and my child body isn't used to staying silent. If I see something and I have a question, I can ask that question. I remember being in church. I think I was about 5 or 6 years old, and I was watching the preacher preach, had no concept of what he was really saying, but I got into my head, I wonder if those 2 giant ferns up on the stage were real. And so I remember taking my finger and mouthing the words to the preacher, "Are those real?" over and over again, until he kind of had to wave me off to basically say, "I need you to stop doing that, Adam." Because my mind, I was like, well, if I have a question, I'm supposed to ask it. And I want to know if those plants that are up there with you, are they real or are they plastic? And so that silence piece of it, me knowing that I'm supposed to be silence there, was difficult. So we have to prepare them for that. And then the crying and displays of emotion, we talked about that a little bit before, but what does it look like? And that sometimes people do cry at events like this, at funerals, and what that means. All right. What are they going to see? A casket or an urn? What is that? What is it going to look like? And then again, if we have a casket, are we going to potentially see a body that's no longer alive? And what is that body going to be wearing? The clothing, clothing both for what the body may be wearing, what the deceased may be wearing, but also what other people may be wearing. Been involved in funerals that it's very typical funeral black, but also been in funerals where they identify them as celebrations of life, where individuals are wearing the person who died favorite color. So there was a lot of purple in the space, not black, but purple. And why is there purple in that space? And preparing the child for that we're wearing purple because that was your grandfather's favorite color, and we want to honor him. So that's why we're wearing purple. The flowers and the decor. Again, if this is the first time that a child's been to a funeral, they may not understand or have ever seen this many flowers in one space before. And what does that mean? It goes back to that choreography I talked about. Flowers are very present at weddings, but they're also very present at funerals. And so these two times that a child may see this many flowers or decor, talking about why people sent those flowers, that they sent them because they wanted to remember your grandpa, and they wanted us to know how much they loved him. And so what they did is they sent flowers. All right. And then the smell, right? The smell of flowers, a lot of flowers in one space, especially to someone who has sensitivity to those pieces, it may be a lot and it may be overwhelming. Same as it goes with oils and incense that may be burning during a service. What is that going to smell like? And when is that going to happen? And then air fresheners. What is that space going to smell like? I've worked with some fantastic funeral directors who have that as part of their process of saying, here's some of the it was usually this person I was thinking about was Bath and Body Works. Here's some plugins that we have. Is there something that's more comfortable to you in this process? Is there a smell that you want to smell while you're involved in that process? And preparing the child for that smell, because it may smell like grandma's house when you go in there, right? It's a room I've never been in, and there's a chair, there's a casket, and grandma's body who's no longer working is there, but it smells like grandma's house. Why does it smell like grandma's house? Because this is what we did to make it smell like grandma's house. Touch. What will the person feel like if touched? If a child or a teenager wants to touch the body, what is it going to feel like? And where can they touch if that is something that the family wants to limit? Where is a place that you can touch? Always offering that is something that is available, if it is available, but never required. And what is that body going to feel like? And why does that body feel different than yours? That goes back to those death concepts we talked about earlier, right? Is that the cessation of body functions. Our bodies are warm because our bodies are alive. Our hearts are pumping blood through our bodies, and that's what's keeping our body warm. When our heart doesn't pump blood anymore, that's what then makes our body cold. Depending on the age of the child and circumstance, we may not want to talk about processing of bodies at this, but we also could. If there's older children who are curious about what is being done to the body to make sure that it is going to be taken care of, that can be something that's discussed. But for younger children, we can just talk about the heart is no longer pumping blood. The air temperature in the room, what is it going to feel like in the room? And then taste. Where can they get something to eat or drink? Right? Where can they get something if they need something to take care of their bodies? Older children may have really irregular eating schedules immediately after a death. They themselves may be in shock or just in that early stages of mourning and bereavement and not have a desire to eat. But then when they get to the day of, the standing around again takes a toll on the body, and they may need something. Is there a space in your facility where they can grab a soda or orange juice or a bottle of water or crackers or chips? Is there somewhere where they can go and take care of their physical body if need be inside that space? And then is there going to be food at or after the service? I told you I'm from West Virginia, and there two times, right? There's wedding feast and there's funeral feast, and there's just this very it is an honor in my where I'm from to be able to bring dishes to the potluck immediately after the service, because there's someone or usually it's a group of people who don't go to the graveside. They go and set up the food so then the family then can come and eat. So when are we going to eat, and why are we eating afterwards? Just something to keep in mind. Now, some options for before or in lieu. This may be some things that the family wants to take into consideration. If they do not want to come to the service, maybe have a memorial service at home or at a special location. Do something where they can have a time to remember the person who died at their pace, in their location, wearing the clothes they want to wear, doing the things that they want to do. They can have that before the service, or they can do it in lieu of attending the service if the child doesn't want to attend, or if the family doesn't want the child to attend. Creating a photo album of the person who died is another way of being able to do that. Both a physical photo album, But I will let you know that a couple years ago, we had a very beloved family pet who died. And what we were able to do as a family is we were able to create a shared photo album in our photos that then we could put pictures of Gus in that photo album. So we had them all. We didn't, no one person had all of those photos, but we had a place where we could put them digitally that we can look at when we need to remember him. So you can also print them off, but know that in this age of digital time and space, that may be an option too. Invite a child to draw a picture or paint a picture. That keyword being invite. I especially during these times, telling a child what to do can contribute to that feeling of helplessness again. Again, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's happening. That's so inviting them and letting them know that there's options available. And then host a child-centered story sharing time. This is one where that children get to tell stories about the person who died, and they get to have those conversations and they get to lead those things, because sometimes children don't tell stories that may be the things that you want to tell at a service. They may, children, especially younger ones, love to talk about body functions, and that may not be something that you want to talk about. Do you remember that time Grandpa burped at Thanksgiving and it was so loud and we all laughed? That may not be what they want to share at the service, but that's such an important story. The child does want to share it and have a story sharing time. It can be done before or in lieu of, but just preparing a child to be able to have those conversations. Kelly, I do not see any questions, but do you?
I do. So there's a couple if you want to
All
just
right,
take a
please.
moment. Um, so the first question is asking, the first person is asking, what if the child wants to attend, but the caregiver does not allow them to go?
Absolutely. In this instance, it's going to be a lot more cut and dry than I probably would normally say, but then it's really going to default to the caregiver, right? We can do our best to share information, and we can do what we can to talk about how our space invites children and holds space for children and what's going to happen if we have those pieces. But ultimately, if a caregiver is like, nope, I don't want to do that, then we have to default to the caregiver. The caregiver themselves may not have the ability to have a child present at the service. We encourage, we invite, we say, can we? I'm curious about your apprehension. Is there anything that I can do to help facilitate the child being there? And offering some of those suggestions. Maybe there's some things we can do, maybe there's some things that we don't do. But offering those suggestions, and it's very similar to a child saying, are you going to die? What they want to know is my child going to be able to be taken care of, and by whom? So sometimes if you can anticipate those questions and answer those, that can help facilitate that child being able to be present if the caregiver is hesitant.
And then another funeral director pointed out that funeral directors will use the plastic liners, I'll call them, underneath the clothing, and if a
Uh-huh.
child is allowed to touch, they may
Yeah.
hear the crinkling. And how do you explain that?
Um, I would say exactly what you just said. I mean, Kelly, you did a beautiful job explaining it as you asked the question. Is that there's times that we put things underneath the body, that are underneath the clothes, between the body that's no longer working and the clothes, because that's what's needed. That needs to happen when a body no longer works. And that's what you say. But I love the fact that that's known and that's anticipated, and can talk about that, and say that that's what that's for. Again, going into how a body is processed or cared for doesn't usually at this point in time have to happen. I will say sometimes children are more curious than adults, and children want to know that information, whereas an adult may feel like it's too much information to have at the time because they don't want to think about their loved one having that experience. So just saying, this is what we do when a body dies, we put down this material between the body and the clothes, so you may hear it if the body's touched. And again, well, why do you do that? It's just something we do when a body dies. can be an answer that hopefully has the child know that it's time to move on from the question.
And then just one more. Oftentimes families bring children into the funeral home, but they keep them in the other room.
Mhm.
Um, how do you approach that with the parents? Because you often see the children trying to peek around and see what's going
Yes.
on, what they're missing.
Is that our last question, Kelly?
It is.
All right, because it actually sets me up for what I'm about to talk about next. It's beautiful. So let me answer that question by talking about the during the service and what to do and how that works. So when we have adults who may try to keep them in different rooms, there's some things to consider. One is how do we support the child during that time if the child wants to be in the room or out of the room. So talking about having a support person the child trusts, this being either a family or friend, or I have even seen where there's individuals at funeral homes or at facilities where there's someone who is dedicated to be with the children, and it's done in a way where they work on developing a relationship with the child before the service, so they're even available sometimes during the arrangement making conversations. So this is not the first time that this person has seen the child, and nor the first time the child has seen the person. And so that can help with that about being in the room, because if the child wants to leave the room, either to go to the bathroom or anything along those lines, that adult is there. Please hear me though, depending on the loss, we may find it hard for caregivers to have children out of their sight. So if the loss is another child, or if the loss is someone the child really was attached to, I've seen where caregivers have a hard time letting the child be out of their sight. And so you're having these conversations like number 3, which is what is the agreed upon exit strategy? So when the child is ready to step out, even if it's during the service, what does that look like? When you need to step out, all you need to say is this, and then we're going to go ahead and step out. Or if the parent or caregiver needs an exit strategy to say, I would like the child to be out now, in order for the caregiver to be able to stay present and the child to have some of the experiences, that exit strategy conversation is helpful. Also having a remote viewing area / a baby cry area where the service is being broadcast, where it can be seen, but it doesn't have the same level of silence or things along those lines. So if a child has questions, they can ask questions, or if it's receiving and being part of that process without being in that physical room that the caregiver may have a concern with. But also having a child and teen friendly space available, where they can go to and be is important, and what that may look like. Play and distraction items available in the room. So these are things that may be um, like a coloring book in the room where the service will be held. So a child has access to the coloring book and a few crayons. I wouldn't do a 64 pack. I would do maybe an 8 or 16, because you don't want to have to pick up 64 crayons after every service. But something available in that space that is already there that you can then reference to the caregiver and say, there is things available in there. And these things need to be quiet. So if you do any fidgets, make sure they're not noisy fidgets. They're not something that's going to distract from others in that space. And then a known support personnel available. That goes back to the kind of bookends. The first would be more of someone who is a friend of the family, and the last would be someone who maybe is employed by the funeral home, who can provide that level of support and can specifically help with the facilitation of where the child is during the process. Because again, if the caregiver doesn't want the child in the space and the child's trying to peek around the room, then how do we create a space away from that so the child can be present at the service in some ways, but also is not in a way where it is going to distract from the caregiver's experience, or the child is not witnessing something the caregiver may not want them to see. Um, So hopefully that helped address that question, Kelly.
Yeah, it is. And we had one more come in. I don't know if now is a good time for that or not.
Please.
How do you explain cremation to a child without them being frightened?
Yes. So I want to show. I'm about to do something that is one of my biggest pet peeves, but I'm going to do it because I want you to see it. I'm going to skip through a couple things real quick, and I want to show you two things here. There's two resources that are available, and we want to thank the New York State Funeral Directors Association for partnering with us in the creation of these materials. These are actually in the very final phases. We actually had a meeting this morning on being peer reviewed and having their the information reviewed in it. It was created by individuals who are currently working in the field, both individuals who are working with children who are bereaved and funeral professionals, individuals who are in daily working in these spaces. And there's two resources here. The first is the Children and End of Life Memorials and Rituals. Inside of that resource, which is free, it's actually free to everyone, but I'm going to make sure that Kelly gets the links to these information to be able to disseminate in the best way for you all. That has some conversations on how to talk about certain things, and cremation is in there. And the fact of the matter is, even when we talk about what cremation is, it still can potentially be really, really, really scary, right? It really can be. But what I like to share with adults and caregivers is that it's probably even scarier in a child's mind what they come up with that may not be the truth. And so if we do not provide the information, if we do not talk to children about what the process is, and so roughly I believe what it says, it talks about that the body is put inside of a box, and then the box is put inside of a very, 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 very hot furnace. And it makes the body turn to ashes, and the only thing that's left is bones. And the ashes are what's inside of the urn. And so we have that conversation, and whereas that can be scary, the thing I want to propose is the alternative is a child creating the experience that's even scarier. Right. And that's what I encourage folks to think about, and especially with the adults and the caregivers I work with, is that if we're not having these conversations with children on developmentally appropriate levels, it doesn't mean they're not thinking about it. It just means they're thinking about it in ways that may be extremely frightening and isolating. Because if we're not having the conversation, then sometimes what the message they're getting is we're not going to talk about that. So that children and end of life memorials and rituals, that one is fantastic for everyone. I really, even for adult caregivers. So if anyone comes into your facility, you can reference the materials. Again, these are all free on our website. And the one that was created specifically through the partnership, both of these were, but the Creating Space for Children in Funeral Home, in a funeral home, has conversations as to different size spaces and budgets, what can be done. Right. So even if you don't have a permanent space that could be dedicated for children and teens, how do you create a portable one? What does that look like? And we have lists of items that you may want to consider purchasing or collecting to have available in those places. So we start all the way from portable spaces that may not have the budget at the time, up to medium-sized spaces that may have the space but not a large budget, then up to a space where you have a dedicated space and you have a budget that you feel comfortable starting with. Here are the things that we would encourage there. So these two resources, again, I would love to share them with you today, but I also don't want to share them until they are actually absolutely peer reviewed. I don't want to share them until other folks in the funeral industry have looked at them and said, yep, this is feasible, this is doable, and it works like what we're doing. And that should be ready within the next couple days.
Great. And I was just going to mention at the end that the New York State Tribute Foundation is partnering with the National Alliance for Children's Grief on these resources that we're going to be sending out to funeral homes shortly, it sounds like. So we're very
It
excited for that.
It's very, and I am too, because this is the information that I presented in New York is much better presented in this information, meaning it goes into detail. I have a couple slides on what those child-friendly spaces may look like. This resource goes into detail, letting you know how to set those up, whereas my conversation today would just be that they need to exist. So we're very, very honored to be able to be partnering with you. And once you receive them, you realize that you're also referenced and mentioned in them. So it's very much appreciated. Um, the
Great.
last thing, the last thing I'll share as we wrap up is that on our NACG website, one of the biggest and most important things that we've added is this find a support or center or camp near you. Not everyone needs bereavement services after a loss. That's important to know. Not everyone needs to go to a counselor. Not everyone needs peer support, but if you find that your families are looking for that information, going to nacg.org, and at the very top, you see that Find Support button. It will take you to this page where you can put in your zip code and find what resources are available in the areas around you, both individuals and centers that may be providing different types of grief support. And so that is available to you and something that you can reference to your families as they're looking for additional services after the funeral.
Great. Adam, thank you so much for joining us today. This was an amazing webinar, and I hope everyone, you got some really valuable information from it. And like I said, we'll be following up with all of you as soon as the resource is available. I just want to remind you that please allow 5 to 7 business days before you see the CEU reflected in your portal. And as always, if you have any questions, you can reach out to us. Thank you again, Adam, and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Take care.